Today I want to talk to you about shutter speed. So shutter speed is the thing in your camera that determines how long the opening is open, how long light can get into your camera. Every camera has a shutter on it, even your cell phone cameras, because that's what opens and closes to let the light in to record the picture. Our cameras like this, our SLR cameras, this is a digital camera, but it is exactly like my first film camera that I ever owned. It has a shutter speed and an aperture that are both manually changed to control my exposure. So today we're going to talk about the actual shutter speed. What is the shutter speed? Well, I just told you. The shutter speed is the length of time that the shutter of your camera is open and allowing light to record your film. So if you have a shutter speed, well, first of all, your shutter speed is on the top of your camera on the cameras that you'll have for class. That's usually where you can find it. Every camera is different, but it is a dial with a bunch of numbers on it that range probably from 1,000 to 1. Now, cameras can go higher or lower than that depending on the camera, but most of the cameras we use stop at 1,000 and then also stop at 1. What does that number represent? Well, it represents a unit of time, which I'm going to explain in a little bit. The first thing that unit of time controls is the amount of light that records the picture. Okay, so how long your shutter is open helps decide how much light comes in. It's kind of like if you turn on the faucet in your kitchen. Turn the faucet on and then you turn it off right away. You're only getting a little bit of water. But if you turn it on and walk away and piddle around the kitchen and empty the dishwasher, you're going to have a ton of water. Your shutter speed works the same way as your faucet. So for example, if you have a really long shutter speed, you're going to have a photo that is really, really bright because so much light has come in. You're getting more light and more light. Whereas if you lessen your shutter speed or do a faster shutter speed, it lets in a lot less light and you have a much darker picture. So, a test. These are kind of trick questions. First of all, you have a bunch of shutter speeds on your camera. What do those numbers represent? I'm going to go back here for just a second, okay? I'm going to use this white space. If you have those shutter speeds, like I said before, all represent a unit of time. So our highest one, our highest number is 1,000, okay? A shutter speed of 1,000 represents something very specific. It doesn't represent 1,000 seconds. It actually represents 1 over 1,000. So 1/1000th of a second, okay? The same is true if you have a shutter speed of 2. If you have a shutter speed of 2, that's not 2 seconds, it is 1/2 of a second. So it really just is all about the fractions. Now, once you get into some fancier cameras, like mine right here, or just, cameras that have more bells and whistles, you start to see shutter speeds that look like 2 // like 2 and then quotation marks. That represents that equation, or I'm sorry, that fraction actually flipped. So instead of 1/2 of a second, it's 2 whole seconds. So I have my camera here. I'm going to have you listen here. I'm going to play for you, and hopefully you can hear it on this. I have it set on a shutter speed of 1,000. So I want you to listen. Okay, hopefully you could hear that. It was very fast. The shutter opened and closed instantaneously. There are not many things you can do in 1/1000th of a second. Now, if I change my shutter speed to 2, all right, so we decided that a shutter speed of 2 is actually 1/2 of a second. I want you to listen. That was much slower. You could hear open, pause, close. Now, if I change it even more than that, and I'm going to go to the 1, then quotation marks, that's 1 whole second. Hold on. Having a hard time focusing. All right. So you can hear how it gets slower and slower because the shutters open longer and longer. Oh. There we go. All right. So we talked about that. Now, here's the test. What is a faster shutter speed? Is 250 or is 500? Which one's faster? If you answered 500, you were right. How about 2 or 4? Which one is faster? Hopefully you said 4. Or if you have 500 or 1, which is faster? 500. And so if you get all those right, then you're probably going to understand the slower shutter speeds. Which is slower? Is it 125 or 8? 8 is slower. So the smaller the number on your shutter speed, the slower the shutter, the longer the shutter is open. Okay, 1 second for 1, which stands for 1 second, is way longer than 1/500th of a second. So it controls the amount of light, but there's another thing it controls, and that is how motion is recorded onto your film. This is one of my favorite things about photography, is controlling your camera and how it takes pictures. My cat and dog are fighting. How it controls the motion that you see in your pictures. So here we have 3 pinwheels that you see. The first one is frozen in time. That means they used a really, really fast shutter speed. For example, a shutter speed of 500, 1/500th of a second is so fast that really nothing can happen in 1/500th of a second. So nothing can move in that speed. So it is completely stopped in motion. It's frozen. In the middle, we probably have a shutter speed of something more like 30 or 60. Now 30, again, represents 1/30th of a second. And that still seems, to me, incredibly fast, 1/30th of a second. But it's not fast enough to freeze things in photography, but it kind of does. Then we have a pinwheel that is really kind of blurred. But you'll notice that the colors aren't all blended together. You can still see a separation of colors. This is probably like a shutter speed of maybe 15, so 1/15th of a second, maybe 8, 1/8 of a second. It's still really, really fast, but it is way slower when you compare it to 500. Some reasons you might use fast shutter speed, if you look here, you have things frozen. So somebody punching the water, you can see the frozen droplets in this. Here's another example of a photo that where the frozen motion, you're capturing a moment. The cool thing about a fast shutter speed is that you're capturing a moment that is there, but none of us have ever actually gotten to see before. Because in real life, we see the movement, we see the motion. How many of you have seen a dog that's like shaking his head like that? We all have. But to see this specific moment, that is the only thing that photography can capture. Photography is the only thing that can capture that and create a new moment for us to notice. Here's somebody's busting a light bulb with a hammer. It seems like a crazy thing to do, and if you were sitting there in that room with it, it would go so fast that you would have no idea what was happening, and you'd probably be like, why are you doing that? But when you capture it with a photograph and that moment that we otherwise wouldn't get to see, suddenly there's something really beautiful about it. And that is what makes it so interesting. Again, you can use your fast shutter speeds to capture motion. However, what if you want to show blurred motion, which can be just as beautiful as frozen motion? Here we have a dancer. You can see she's twirling around, and by creating and recording that whole movement with a slow shutter speed, now we're also creating a whole new way to look at a situation. Water that's moving. This is looks like kind of some rapids. The water is moving. If you have your shutter open long enough for that water to move while your shutter's open, it will record. It's almost like it's drawing lines onto your photo. It's recording that all over that course of time. Same with this. This is a great example of kind of drawing into your photo. These cars, the taillights and the headlights, are moving along the road, and they are actually recording that light onto the camera the whole time the shutter's open. This shutter was probably open for minutes, not just seconds. Here we have star trails. So as this Earth spins and how it makes the stars kind of appear as though they're moving and they're riding, like kind of drawing themselves across the picture. This picture is very interesting because this is what happens when you combine a really slow shutter speed with the use of a flash or flash bulbs. Flash is another thing that stops motion. We will not use flash very often in this class. If you take Black and White 2 or you get more advanced or an experiment, I do have flashes available to use. And if you want to borrow them for this assignment, I certainly will let you experiment with them. But flash is like a fast shutter in that it stops motion, it freezes it. And if you combine that with a slow shutter speed, then you have this movement that's recorded onto the film, along with a frozen moment that's recorded by the flash. And speaking of flash and light and those tail lights, you can also use a really slow shutter speed to record light onto your picture and drawing with light. And that's an assignment that we'll talk about later on in the semester. Again, it's almost poetic when you have this softness. There's a softness to photos that show motion. Okay, this is really interesting. And if you took digital imaging with Mrs. Dale, I know that you've done this because I've seen the pictures in the hallway. But panning is something else you can do with a slow shutter speed. If you were taking this photo and just holding your camera still, the taxi would be blurred, but everything else would be frozen. If you move your camera at the same rate as the taxi, though, then you have the car is mostly in focus and everything else looks like it's speeding by. This is called panning. Here's another example of somebody on a bike and the panning that you can create. You can really use this to create some very artistic and cool photos. You can actually do panning even without a still object. You can use your camera with a slow shutter speed to draw pictures or to zoom in and out and play around with that as well. Anytime your shutter is open, it's recording onto the film. Here are some common shutter speeds that I want you to fill out on your worksheet. There are ones that we already went over and kind of talked through. So when you get a chance, I want you to write those down onto your handout so you have them. Now, the last one, B, what I told you we talked about. B stands for bulb. This allows the shutter to stay open as long as you want it to. I even have shutter release cables that you can screw into the your shutter release button, and you could catch the cable down and walk away and leave your shutter open for hours if you wanted to. That's how a lot of these star trails are recorded onto film and onto digital. This is used mostly for night photography and because when you need longer exposures, if you used an exposure that was minutes long when you were in daylight, you would not be able to, it'd be way too bright. It would never even show up. So really, this is when you have very, very low light situations. If you are using a B, you need to use a tripod. Okay, there's no way you can hold still with the B setting. There's no way you can hold still with any shutter speed that is lower than 6